Okay, greetings everyone, and welcome to this first Climate Tracker Caribbean Community Hangout. I am genuinely so very happy to have you with us. For this session, I'm very excited to let you know that we'll be discussing COP27, and we have two very experienced climate persons that I will introduce you to in more detail further on. At this session today. So I hope that you're excited to hear from them and to learn from them and also to ask some very important questions. So firstly, I'd like to share a little bit more about Climate Tracker so that you know exactly the lens that we're coming from and so that you have an idea of what Climate Tracker is. All right, so let me just share my screen. Okay, so what is Climate Tracker? Climate Tracker is basically an international nonprofit organization, and we aim to support, train, and incentivize better climate journalism. We operate under the belief that storytelling and journalism is of great importance, especially when it comes to issues such as climate change and the environment, when you need to take big technical issues and make it understandable for everyone. All right, so that's where we operate from. How do we do this? We basically provide training and fellowships for young journalists around the world to tell better climate stories locally. We conduct action-oriented media research to better understand the biggest challenges, trends, and obstacles for powerful climate reporting. And we fund young journalists to report at the world's biggest events, such as COP. And later on, you'll be meeting some of our past COP fellows from the Caribbean, as well as our current COP fellows who will be reporting on what's happening, what will happen in Egypt this year. And we also support global collaborations between young climate journalists, newsrooms, and NGOs around the world. Right, so that's what we do. And basically this year, we have seen a lot of progress in the Caribbean team and Climate Tracker. I'm happy to say that we've had programs around energy transition, we've had programs around climate justice and citizens climate reporting. So our team, our Caribbean Climate Tracker team is growing exponentially, and I'm really happy about that. So I'm just happy to let you know that, you're part of a community that is growing. So thank you so much for joining us today. And if you ever have any questions about Climate Tracker, about who we are, what we do, you can always reach out to me. My name is Dizan Billy. I am the Caribbean Regional Director at Climate Tracker. All right, so I won't go more than that into who we are. You can always reach out to me, but now it's the meat of the matter, and that is COP27, and from a Caribbean perspective. So allow me to introduce to you first our guest speaker. He is a good friend of mine in the climate space, Tyrone Hall. Tyrone is a climate change specialist with over a decade of in-country research, intergovernmental and industry experience across the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and the Pacific region. Tyrone has an exceptional record of harnessing diverse institutional voices, directly strengthening and boosting outcomes aligned with core priorities. His climate policy and communication competence is grounded in award-winning doctoral research. He earned both Vanier and Ontario Trillium Awards, the two most prestigious in Canada for his doctoral work. Tyrone is passionate about previously taught advanced level university courses on climate and food politics and supported the deployment of tech and rural economic development in Africa and Latin America. So I'm very excited to introduce you to Tyrone, who will now lead us in his presentation. Tyrone?
Thanks, Dizan. Good morning, everyone. Really happy to share space with Rena, who I've had the real privilege to work with in the past, and of course, to talk to people from the Caribbean about COP and, it's reflecting on what happened last year and looking ahead to a week and a half from now and what's at stake for us. So what I'm going to do quickly is to just cover a couple of the highlights about what we walked into last year, what were some of the major takeaways, obviously not exhaustive, and trying to tee up what I think are some of the interesting themes and possible messaging opportunities for us from the Caribbean, for people from vulnerable regions in general, that we could really plug into and amplify a lot of the work that folks like Rowena and the negotiators and our ministers are going to be championing big time. So reflecting on COP26 and what's informally known as the Glasgow Pact, I think a couple of key points are important in terms of reinforcing. The big takeaway, though, from Glasgow is that progress was made, but absolutely never nearly enough. But I just caveat it by saying, when you look at the COP space, and I think the folks inside the COP space generally struggle or fail to communicate this part of it, which is that it's everything that happens in that process is kind of designed to be incremental. It's just how multilateralism works. It was never designed to deliver sweeping social change. Every time you look to a process like that for it and you say, oh, it's moving too slow, and you assume that the slowness is a failure, it's a misreading of what the space is. It's designed to nudge you forward. It's multilateralism was never designed to bring about sweeping social change. You kind of pushed for that at your country level, and even there, that's a challenge. I think it's important to note it. But what the Glasgow Pact does is to recognize the urgency of the challenge, and what ministers from across the world were able to agree to was that countries should come back this year with even stronger 2030 emissions reductions targets. So we are expecting to see better NDCs, but as you would have heard yesterday when the synthesis report was released, we're not quite there yet. And the aim of having the stronger emission reduction targets being presented this year was to close the gap to ensure that we have more 1.5 degree compatible plans. So we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees is what that means. Ministers also agreed that developed countries who bear the responsibility for the action, both primarily in terms of cutting emission reductions and providing the finance that's needed to facilitate adaptation work at the scale and pace we need in vulnerable parts of the world, like our region, is that they would urgently deliver more resources to help our regions to adapt efficiently. That's, of course, as you can see, still a struggle. Those resources are urgently needed to do like practical things, from, kind of mitigating and pivoting around the dwindling crop yields that we see, the devastating storms that we've been facing. Beyond the Glasgow Pact, though, at COP26, countries also made a couple of bold collective commitments to curb things like methane emissions, to halt and to reverse forest loss, align the finance sector with net zero. So lots of great things happened on the sidelines that we don't often talk a lot about in the Caribbean, just because we are so focused on the existential aspects of the debate, sort of making sure that our developed country counterparts are cutting emissions, that their financial flows, that loss and damages is a key part of it. So I think sometimes we kind of miss those other pieces. And so in many ways, our private sector is left off the hook. And there is also the big commitment, and all of those kind of financial sector moves with the net zero targets are really aimed towards 2050 as a North Star. Of course, there is a big commitment and discussions around ditching the internal combustion engine, as well as accelerating, and hear this very specific language because I remember really clearly how it really came down to haggling over this language, which is phasing out of coal rather than eliminating coal, moving away from it, as well as ending international financing for fossil fuels, just to name a few of the big pieces. You can also think of Glasgow as a platform for the launching of really innovative sectoral partnerships and new funding to support a range of issues, some of which I've mentioned, all with the aim of reshaping every sector of the economy and doing that at the scale that's needed to deliver a net zero future. And I think that that element of the developments that we saw in Glasgow is really fascinating, because there are so many so many of the big pieces of the Paris Agreement were unresolved that we are finally nudging towards, and we're not even fully getting there yet, where we're squarely talking about means of implementation. So we're still sort of hashing out some of the structural elements. So when you start to hear about more specific things, more of the practicalities of how we can move forward and how you can dynamize sectors, and you see it emerging with COP27 now, where even things like food security is squarely on the table, a very specific realm of action that we can take and start working through. And so you can bring people more into the space because it's now closer to how you're living, and you can perceive what this means for me and my country and my economy, and literally nutrition, right? So that's one example of how we see progress coming forward. But as I was saying, despite all the significant headways on a range of fronts, some of which I've mentioned, national climate and financing commitments still fell really, really short of what's needed to come to grips with the climate crisis. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the specifics to illustrate that. For instance, like one of the big questions you'd ask when you reflect on COP26 is, did countries commit to the sort of deep 2030 emission cuts and agree to a process that could keep 1.5 degrees Celsius, that goal, alive? It's a mixed bag. On the first bit of it, in terms of deep commitments to 2030 emissions cuts, the answer is very clearly not nearly enough. But for the second bit, the answer is yes. We agreed to a process, right? Remember I was talking about incremental language, a lot of the caveats. I think that is one of the most interesting things about this space, with how success can sometimes be pinned to caveat. Words mean something, and it's just a delicate use of them that will pivot and alter how you interpret many of the elements of what you'll see in the process. So by the end of COP26, what we saw was that 151 countries had submitted new climate plans, what's terribly described as nationally determined contributions. I think that's one of the funniest things about the language. If it's a national contribution, it's nationally determined, right? And I'm saying this because many of us in this particular space are people who care about language and communicability of things, but that's just one of the ways where language can sometimes both be a fascinating thing and a really discombobulating aspect of the process. And so those 150 countries had made those new climate plans to articulate how they're going to slash their emissions by 2030. And this is all to keep the goal of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 within reach. And to do all of that, we need to cut global emissions. At that point, the projection was that we needed to cut by a half by the end of this decade. In contrast, the UN was really putting out calculations that all of those figures, when you take them together, would put the world on track to 2.5. And I think with the synthesis report that we saw yesterday, the glance I took at it was that if we were to achieve everything countries are putting on the table, we'll be on track to 2.7, which is 0.2 above where we were with the commitments the last time. So that suggests a number of things. Either we've just burnt more fossil fuel than we were doing at that stage, or we are backtracking on our commitments, right? Rowena could potentially give some more clarity on that when she contributes. There is also the big question of, when you reflect on COP26, of did developing countries get the finance and support they need? And that's a critical, problematic point, because you can have all the plans you desire. And one of the things that we have to give ourselves credit for in the developing world is the plans are much more credible. In the past, they were just sort of pipe dreams, if you will, but substantially now we have costed plans. So they're not just some uncosted, unquantified things. We have really sophisticated NDCs emerging now. So they're realistic, they're costed. And the reason that's important is you need to know what these plans will cost in order to give them some sense of realism and practicality. But a lot of the climate finance space up to this point is just based on arbitrary numbers. So in 2009, rich countries had committed to mobilize about $100 billion a year by 2020 and through 2025 to support climate efforts in developing countries. In the Glasgow Pact, they had to acknowledge with deep regret is a particular language that developed countries had failed to meet that goal in 2020. And that's I think based on OECD estimates at the time, they had only gotten to a total of 79.6 billion in 2019. But remember, this was an annual commitment through to 2025, right? So the COP26 outcome was very clear. Developing countries insisted on this, that these countries are still on the hook to fulfill this goal as soon as possible. And it stipulates that these countries must report on their progress. But we're going into COP27, they still haven't met that commitment. We were aware that they wouldn't have met the commitment on time, but it is one of the things that developing countries are going to keep asking for. And I think it's important to reflect on that and to use as a part of the messaging crux going forward, because at the same time you're saying we need a new kind of quantified climate finance goal, particularly for adaptation, it is important as a trust building mechanism to hold our developed country counterparts accountable for their promises, because a lot of what the multilateral process is built on is trust, and this is a trust building mechanism. So that's why it's an important continuous point. But from a messaging perspective, being very well aware of why you're harping on the $100 billion and how you keep trumpeting that message while saying it is not nearly enough without seeming to be contradicting it. And I think a lot of little wobbliness can happen from time to time when we talk about that. The adaptation fund, another good piece of news out of COP26 is that the adaptation fund had reached unprecedented levels in terms of contributions, with new pledges of up to $356 billion. But that was almost like 3 times its mobilization target for 2022. So that's good news. LDC, the LDC fund, which supports climate change adaptation in the world's least developed countries, also received record levels of funding. So lots of really good progress. We're moving in the right direction on those targets, but not nearly enough. Loss and damage was a really contentious subject at COP26, and you'll see it emerging as a dominant theme. I frankly think it's going to be one of the deciding factors, or one of the biggest things, most exciting elements of the discussion to track for COP27. And quickly, just so we're on the same page, loss and damage, how I see loss and damage is that I think it captures the existential element, the justice element of the climate debate most directly, because the reason we need loss and damage is related to adaptation, but it's separate. And it's separate because there are limits to adaptation, right? There are some things that you lose because of climate risks, vulnerability, and impacts that you can never regain. So it's irreplaceable. So you take the Pakistani case, for instance, right? Most of the impacts from the floods they had wiped out their agricultural bed. And even if you quantify the immediate loss to the agricultural space, you've lost your productive capacity, you've lost connection to other industries and linkages. So there are things you've lost that, just like replacing the estimated $10 billion to the sector that you can see up front, masks the incapacitation of your whole productive capacity and the ripple on kind of economic sort of damage that will happen. It's unquantifiable in many cases. And that's just one example. How do you account for that? How do you you can't under adaptation mechanism. So adaptation is that separate but related construct that allows us to deal with the repertory elements of it. So one of the common sense kind of phrases that have been used, and I don't think I like it very much, but it's what's being dominant. It's climate reparations. It's problematic just because reparations as a term causes foreclosures for engagement. Nobody wants to engage with that subject because it comes with political baggage, right? But that's essentially what it is. And that all that was lip service was paid to it. It was basically just saying there would be a discussion about the process going forward. But what islands or segments of vulnerable populations were championing was a loss and damage facility with dedicated funding. So that will emerge. There are a couple of key research papers put forward by the V20 with a set of mechanisms. So not just a facility, but different ways of funding it, including tax incentives and a number of other aspects. So there are 4 key elements in that research paper. I'd encourage everybody to engage with it. And a couple of developed country partners at a subnational level made really strong pledges. So Scotland, within the construct of the UK, made a pledge. I think it was £2 million or £1 million pounds, and Wallonia, again, another kind of subnational grouping within Belgium, the federal construct, also contributed about €1 million, 1 point something million dollars. So there was momentum, but not at the scale and not at the full-throated national level that was expected. So that's what we've seen, some movement on that, most recently with national level commitments coming forth out of Scandinavia. I think the Danes made a really substantial commitment of about $10 million this year. So you could see some really good, really positive momentum coming into COP27. And then the final bit of direct reflection on COP26 that I'd like to share is really around the question of negotiators agreeing to rules that can maintain the integrity and ambition of the Paris Agreement. So remember, I was starting out by saying that we've just been in this constant discussion since Paris Agreement of how you fully activate it. And that meant defining a couple of the key elements that would give structure and clarity to how the Paris Agreement was taking shape. And because those things are unsettled, we couldn't quite move to the deep, very specific discussions and means of implementation, which we're finally getting towards now. I think that's a key question, and how I reflect on that is to say many of the rules of underpinning how the Paris Agreement will be implemented which were adopted in 2018. We made some really good traction on settling some of those key questions at COP26. And the most notable to me are on the question of international carbon markets. So after about 5 years, now 6 years of negotiations, governments are finally able to settle on the rules of the global carbon market under the Paris Agreement, Article 6. And one of the most contentious issues in recent years, because it's been one of the most contentious issues, negotiators try to balance finally reaching an agreement on the rules while ensuring that they didn't undermine climate ambition, but instead maintaining what's sort of commonly referred to as environmental and social integrity. Ultimately, what the negotiators agreed to was to avoid double counting. It's been a big concern, especially when you think about the kind of wild west that carbon markets existed as before this. And in this case, more than one country was able to claim the same emission reductions as counting towards their own climate commitments. And that was a critical thing to clarify to make real progress in reducing emissions. Countries also decided that 5% of proceeds must go towards funding adaptation under the traditional market mechanism. So that was huge progress through bilateral trading of credits between the countries. Contributing funds towards adaptation was only strongly encouraged though. So again, that's another thing that the COP agreements will do when they can't really make an agreement. Things are strongly encouraged or will be pursued. And that was done to reduce potential, to reduce which may ultimately reduce the potential source of finance for adaptation. But one unfortunate thing is that countries decided they would allow the carryover of old carbon credits that were generated since 2013. And that was under a very fraught mechanism called the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism that was under the Kyoto Protocol. And that's just like an opt-out, a cop-out to really help them to meet their climate commitments under the PA. I think countries like Brazil insisted on this substantially. At COP27, it's going to be crucial that the negotiators can put stringent guidelines in place to ensure that any further older credits that are allowed to be used represent real emission cuts and not just, as some people would say, or okay, I will hold this, hot air. Two other pieces, common timeframes were discussed. This is really important. You had people, kind of countries submitting NDCs along ad hoc timelines. So you don't really know what you're comparing because there is no shared horizons. So countries in Glasgow, they're encouraged to use common timeframes now. It's such a basic thing. So in practical terms, what it means is that new NDCs that countries put forward in 2025 will have an end date of 2035, rather than some doing it at different points from others. And then in 2030, they're going to put forward commitments with a 2040 end date. It sounds really pedantic, really procedural, but you need a common reference point to do things, and timeframes would be one of them, and aligning their NDC target dates around 5-year cycles. It was also an agreed time and an agreed goal. On the transparency side of things in Glasgow, all countries agreed to submit information about their emissions and their financial, their tech, and capacity building support using a common and standardized set of formats and tables. So really some procedural things were done, but what it means is we know what we're tracking, and it makes sense across party lines, so you can really compare and have a better sense. It lends credibility to the whole process. I'll wrap things there. A number of things happen on the side, like I was pointing to, with the different pledges around methane and things related to forest loss and degradation. I'm not minimizing them, but they're outside of the main process, very significant, and many of them worth tracking for us. In terms of the next step going into COP, as I was suggesting, I think this is a COP where it's Africa in the spotlight. It's another African COP, having inadvertently had back-to-back European COPs, one of them because Chile basically had a difficulty and it was held in Spain. I think it's a unique opportunity from a messaging standpoint for developing countries to, sort of take reins and spotlight their issues and continue to do what islands have led on, which is to really be the moral arbiters of the UNFCCC process. And I say that because I think it's something we should be proud of, because we only talk about adaptation and are able to see it as central and welcoming others now to join us in championing it as being an element of the process that should be as substantially funded and treated on equal par with mitigation, because islands and island negotiators have pushed for it consistently. Remember, we are only talking about 1.5 because islands have been really smart and baked things into the process, even as they weren't getting what they wanted initially. Remember that nice little turn of phrase in the Paris Agreement where because islands couldn't get 1.5 as a primary target, 2 degrees is a goal, but the little conditionality that's agreed to, that's negotiated on and insisted on by islands, that we'll do our best to aim for 1.5, all while having that North Star of 2, and then insisting on that special report on 1.5. I think that was one of the most brilliant things and should be claimed as a success by islands, and having teed that up and then ensuring that the report was done, that 1.5 degree report, which basically laid it bare that we have, this is really where your ambition should be. Otherwise, we're torching the earth. It was tactical stuff. We are only discussing it because islands were smart in taking that long-term view and setting that up. And loss and damage too. Islands have been insisting on loss and damage as a critical, related to a critical component of the process, and climate action related to adaptation, but separate from it. And we see the kind of traction. So even though islands didn't get what they wanted at the last COP, it is back on the agenda, and work has been done in the interim to really amplify it. And you'll see this COP being one where loss and damage, even if you take a look at the position paper the EU issued 2 or 3 days ago, the EU is basically saying, they haven't staked out a position, but they're saying, we want to be a partner, bringing all sides together to deliver an acceptable outcome on loss and damage. I think that's fascinating that the EU has said this going into COP. Islands and vulnerables in general should take a lot of credit for that. I think this is something the press should watch closely. I think this is something the Caribbean should take note of very closely. And then one other element which Caribbean countries, Organization of Caribbean States, recently announced a partnership with the Global Climate Mobility Group. And the full name is escaping me right now, it's GCCM. And that partnership, in association with the World Bank and several other international organizations, is really putting a laser focus on climate mobility in the Caribbean squarely. It's a Caribbean issue, and that's not the same thing as loss and damage, but it is related. You can't separate the two. So that's a theme that should be looked at really closely. There will be a climate mobility pavilion at this COP. So loss and damage, including climate mobility, adaptation, specifically adaptation finance, I think will be a big theme, big issue to look at for this COP. Climate finance overall, and the just energy transition element is emerging as a huge thematic point for this COP as well, especially with the South African model and the challenges and the successes emerging from that. It's, big questions should be asked from vulnerables, especially the Caribbean, about why we aren't considered for systemic, robust funding opportunities like that. And we have to ask that question because the climate crisis is primarily a fossil fuel challenge. And so the primary kind of response to it, especially for us who spend so much of our limited foreign earning resources on importing oil, which with the exception of Trinidad and Guyana now, we don't produce. Only way we're going to protect our economic future is if we can really, really accelerate the transition, the base of energy source of our economy. And we just don't have the economic size to be as attractive for the primarily private sector financing that's being channeled to South Africa to set up the just energy transition there. Just energy transition in quotes, because it's private sector money and it's on almost, I think, 96.7% commercial loan terms. So the question we need to ask is, if it's a just energy transition, why is it primarily private sector funding? And if you care about the most vulnerable, why aren't we on your radar for this? we would like to be considered for this. This is how we see it working. And it's certainly not going to be commercially driven climate finance. I'll wrap there, leave some time for us to engage as we move forward. Back to you, Giselle. Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Tyrone. And I love that, you really brought out what the island nations have been championing and the achievements that AOSIS and the island negotiators have really achieved in the past years at the COPs, because a lot of people, that goes under the radar for a lot of media who tend to report on the bigger things and report on, what the certain heads of state had to say and that sort of thing. So I really love that you brought that out. And we'll talk a little bit about more about that maybe in the breakout rooms that we'll have. So I'll now like to bring on Ruwana. Now, Ruwana, we are so happy to have you. Ruwana is an international climate law and governance specialist. She is a TEDx 2020 speaker with over a decade of experience in the UN climate process. She's a former Trinidad and Tobago diplomat and has negotiated for the Caribbean community as well as the Alliance of Small Island States, including in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. At present, Ruwana is a senior legal advisor at Climate Analytics and director of Climate Analytics Caribbean, which the office for that is in Trinidad and Tobago. Ruwana provides strategic, technical, and diplomatic advice to island states in climate change negotiations, as well as training for officials that are new to the UN climate process. Ruwana, thank you for being with us, and the stage is now yours.
Okay, as it turns out, I'm at the age where if I'm sharing my screen, I can't figure out how to start my video, but I do see a link requesting me to do that now. I shared the screen and then everything else sort of disappeared. So let me try to figure this out.
We can see you.
Okay, great. And I'm also working with two screens, so I'm not really helping myself at this point. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Unfortunately, as I told Desan before, I only have an hour today, which means now I have 15 minutes with you. But I'm glad to be here nevertheless. My work at the COP starts very, very soon. I leave tomorrow and I have a number of things that I still have to get done today, including several meetings. So I'm sorry I won't be with you, but I'll try to be very quick in what I present. And thanks to Tyrone for being very comprehensive. I will try not to repeat things that he has already said. I'd planned to go through with you the few areas you see on screen here, a bit of highlights, some of the highlights from the actual COP27 schedule. I realize that people don't actually coming from outside of the process tend to understand the number of things that are actually taking place there at once and how long the actual meeting is for those of us who have to be there the entire time. Then to go through a bit on the overall geopolitical outlook heading into this COP, and then to look at some key issues in those four areas there: mitigation, adaptation, finance, and loss and damage. So just in terms of the highlights, yes, the COP slug starts much earlier than the 7th November, which is the official start date. Actually, the prep meetings for the LDC group already happening in October, I think from the 31st of October. SIDS will meet from 1 to 2 November, followed by meetings of the G77 on China, the largest developing country bloc, which are going to happen on the 3rd and 4th. There are also additional meetings happening 5th and the 6th ahead of the Heads Summit, what the Egyptians are calling the Sharm el-Sheikh Climate Implementation Summit for World Leaders, which is going to take place on the 7th and the 8th of November. Once the summit is done, we'll continue with, and I think also happening alongside the summit would be negotiations happening within the subsidiary bodies. But alongside these, there are a number of ministerial engagements also expected. So on the 9th, there's a dialogue on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. This is a process where parties are engaged in setting a new quantified goal on finance that would be applied post 2025. The current goal is for 100 billion in climate finance to be mobilized every year. Of course, we know that that goal hasn't been met. Nevertheless, this process to set a new goal is supposed to actually be informed by the actual science and the needs of countries. The 100 billion goal was not, it was kind of a number that was plucked out of the air. And so falls drastically short of the actual needs that are there amongst developing countries for climate finance. So this process is underway. It's a bit rickety, but we expect to see some progress happening on it at this COP. There's also going to be ministerial dialogue on climate finance more broadly, the 5th in a series of such dialogues, as well as the high-level roundtable on pre-2030 ambition, which is the mitigation roundtable. Gender Day is happening on that same day at the 14th, and we have a civil society day happening on the 15th. So what the Egyptians have done is they've given a theme to each day of the COP, and one expects that there will be activities happening along those themes on those particular days. So what's the high-level geopolitical outlook heading into this COP? Short answer, it's not good. It's not good. I imagine it could be worse, but maybe not by much. Every single thing that could go wrong before a COP has gone wrong. We are in the midst of multiple and interrelated crises, which by their very nature have caused governments to be looking more inward rather than outward, to multilateralism, outward to being generous on climate finance, etc. We've had a number of high-level meetings happen throughout this year that have not been encouraging, in particular G20 meetings. The G20 membership actually covers 80% of global emissions. So when they meet to discuss climate, it's of high and great significance what they can agree to in those meetings. And in the past few meetings that they've had, their discussions have not gone well at all. There's been a lot of backtracking by those countries. We know, and Tyrone mentioned this, that finance and adaptation are going to be front and center at this COP. They've also been prioritized by the incoming Egyptian COP presidency, but there's no clarity on what we should expect from these issues. There's a lot of talk. There are a lot of expectations coming from different quarters, some of them conflicting. We know that, for example, thinking about the Glasgow Climate Pact and accountability around the Glasgow Climate Pact, that we want to see progress on that commitment to double adaptation financing. Developed countries are already pushing back strongly on this, saying that the existing reporting arrangements under the Paris Agreement, under the Convention, will allow for that finance to be tracked at the technical level. They're not interested in bringing more high-level political attention to how that commitment is being met. We also know that the 100 billion is not going to be met again this year. Perhaps it will be met by 2023. There's a lot of, a lack of clarity there in terms of understanding what are the plans in place in order to be able to meet that 100 billion. The special circumstances of Africa is an issue that has sort of been in the background as a proposed agenda item since 2016, coming out of COP21 in Paris. And it's one that has been rolled over every single year since then. It has proven to be highly contentious. And now we're heading into an African COP. So there's going to be a high expectation that this matter can be resolved. Alongside that, though, we have about 4 or 5 different proposals for agenda items that could land us in a situation where the start of the COP might be delayed because we can't actually start substantive work until the agenda is agreed. And with all of these issues that have been proposed for the agenda now, including an item on loss and damage finance, it's very likely that there would be discussions that delay the beginning of the COP. I already spoke to the issue of the heightened expectations around finance and the fact that finance is likely to be very contentious. So going into, it would be great if this slide could change. Yeah. Going into very quickly at a very high levels, the thematic issues. So we know from the latest NDC synthesis report that, 1.5 degrees limit, the possibility of staying within that limit is hanging on the edge. We are radically heading in the wrong direction. High level takeaways from that report. What we need to be doing is having global emissions over 2010 levels by 2030, which means we need to peak emissions now and then steadily decline throughout this decade. What the report reveals is that we're actually on target to increase global emissions over 2010 levels by around 11%. At the last census report last year, that increase was actually at around 13%. So there has been some progress made, but we're still heading in the wrong direction. COP27 in this context is actually the last opportunity to try to keep the limit within reach, hopefully by being able to secure commitments to greater climate action, in particular in relation to mitigation. But as I've said, the geopolitical situation doesn't really favor this as an outcome. The starting point would be for us to be able to commit to implementation of the Glasgow Climate Pact, whose provisions give us a chance to be able to keep the 1.5 degree limit within reach as countries do better on their NDCs more broadly. Adaptation funding needs to be seriously scaled, even in the context of warming out to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius. The amount of adaptation funding that is required is around 300 billion, according to the latest adaptation report, GAP report. Right now, adaptation funding is at about 20 billion, with the promise to double from Glasgow. We expect it to reach to about 40 billion, 44 billion maybe. But that is a drop in the mud compared to what is required if we're on a 1.5 degree or 2 degree pathway. We're not on a 2 degree pathway or 1.5 degree pathway. So obviously the quantum of adaptation is going to keep increasing as we fall behind on mitigation commitments. So there are a lot of discussions happening and set to happen at this COP on adaptation and on adaptation financing, including in the context of the global goal on adaptation discussions. AOSIS is hoping that these discussions will be able to produce an early harvest. They're scheduled to conclude in 2024, I believe, but the hope is that they will be able to take some decisions based on the discussions that they've had so far that could possibly include some useful metrics on adaptation to support, to help us to clarify the support that's going into adaptation, to be able to access that support more readily, and to be able to ensure that that support is actually delivering transformational action on the ground. On finance, I guess from this side, what I'd pick out is that questions around access to finance remain a key issue for SIDS. In the grand scheme of things, with the limited adaptation finance that is available, only 2% of that is actually going to SIDS. Tyrone mentioned the Just Energy Transition Partnerships and the fact that SIDS have not been considered for this. This is an issue of some concern, notwithstanding that there are questions around whether and how those partnerships are actually working. There are a number of countries aside from South Africa who have also been identified to receive some of this type of funding, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Senegal. So we see there, a range of middle-income countries, but also Senegal as an LDC that is going to be considered, which to me raises the further question of why SIDS have been left out. But there's a lot that I imagine still needs to be discussed on how those partnerships are actually going to roll out, whether they can be made fit for purpose for SIDS in the first place, would be key among them. And finally, on loss and damage, so I imagine by now you would have heard about the AOSIS proposal for a loss and damage response fund. This proposal is grounded in the notion that the current funding landscape for climate action on the whole, in addition to the fact that it is inadequate and insufficient, does not at all address loss and damage and the needs that countries have to be able to respond to the loss and damage that is already being experienced even at 1.1 degrees of warming. It is really important that this fund is a multilateral one, which means that it should go a long way to ensuring that all SIDS would be able to access this fund. And should go a long way to ensuring that the fund is administered in a manner that is holistic and not just dealing with certain aspects of loss and damage. There are many aspects to the loss and damage landscape, and not all of them receive the amount of attention that they should. It goes way beyond responding to extreme weather events. There's loss and damage caused by slow onset events such as sea level rise. There are countries already losing territory because of this. There are health impacts to loss and damage, mental health impacts to loss and damage, cultural losses that are linked to loss and damage. And these are all sort of packaged under a rubric of non-economic losses. And these are all included in the types of losses that loss and damage that AOSIS is hoping could be addressed eventually by this fund. That being said, the focus for this session is on having the fund established and then launching a process to work out the details of how it will function. In addition to the fund, there have been ongoing discussions on the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage that was agreed in 2019 at the Chile Madrid COP, COP25, I think that was. So this facility really is a network of different actors that operate in siloed areas that touch on different aspects of loss and damage. So in the humanitarian context, in the disaster risk reduction context, in human rights context, and others, insurance, etc. So it's a network bringing all of these actors together to try to coordinate, to provide technical assistance and support to vulnerable countries to help them to be able to address loss and damage. But even this network itself doesn't provide any funding, and it doesn't really spur action on the ground. But with that said, it can play an important role in helping countries to be able to generate data and to understand the loss and damage that is actually taking place within their territory. So it could be quite useful, but it is also at present still underfunded, and there are there's still a lot of outstanding discussions that have to occur in relation to the arrangements for how the network is going to operate, the architecture, where it's going to sit, etc. So with that, thank you very much. I am finished, and I am also out of time and have to run to my next call. So thanks for the opportunity to be here with all of you. Dazan, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to take questions, but I imagine that between yourself and Tyrone, you should be able to field any questions coming out from the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ruana, and thank you so much for your very holistic presentation as well. I do understand that you have to leave, so I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much again. Okay, so thank you everyone who's been sticking around with us. We've learned a lot, I think, in the past hour or so. We've heard from Tyrone, who gave us some very important insights into what happened at COP26, which of course is going to affect what can happen at COP27 this year. So thank you so much to Tyrone and Ruana, who shared with us basically what the island nations or what Caribbean countries are looking forward to at COP27. So if you have any questions now, I would like to invite you for this little short session we'll have of questions and answers. So Tyrone, and most of the questions might be directed to you as we don't have Ruana with us anymore. But if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Or you can put them in the chat at this moment. I see we have a question coming in from Ryan. Ryan, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, Dizan. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for doing this this Caribbean hangout. You know, it's great that our little corner of the Caribbean could contribute in such a big way. Tyrone, it's nice to hear from you again. Nice to see you again. A couple of weeks after we did our Instagram live, I just wonder, given the report that was issued yesterday from the United Nations, I'm sure everybody is sort of aware of that UNFCCC report, a quite grim report given where we should be headed as opposed to where we are headed at the moment. How do you think that will impact COP27 for Caribbean leadership in Egypt next month?
Great to see you again, Ryan. I think that's a great question. I think that so I'm going to lay out what I think the challenge is in responding to it and how I think the region should react to it. And I'm starting with the challenges because I think the Caribbean, everything that happens at COP is about diplomatic machinations and sophistication. And every COP is defined by the presidency. The presidency is a host country. So if you look at the history of COPs, the ones that go off the rails are the ones with countries that don't have a strong diplomatic reputation. Because the presidency is the one that does all the backroom machinations and side group meetings and bringing people together to bridge the positions. And I'm setting that up because the COP27 is not being hosted by a presidency that is known for its diplomatic prowess. We got Paris in large part because the French are steeped, they pride themselves on diplomatic excellence. They've invested in that greatly. The UK, for all the jokes you can make about it in its current state, also invested for centuries in schooling, developing, refining its foreign office and its entire diplomatic sort of machinery. So that's why they're able to deliver successes at COP, even when India and China tried to torch it at the very last moment. They knew what buttons to pull and how to man and corral everyone else. I'm putting that on the table because from my observation of working with different blocks, Caribbean associated blocks, other blocks like the V20 now and the HAC that was instrumental for the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Pact, is unfortunately the Caribbean doesn't have deep diplomatic coordination. And so you'll have individuals who are excellent in diplomatic machinations like Rowena and others, but we don't have diplomatic institutions with the great depth and the capacity to. So I think that's a challenge for the region going into it. You have a few really solid people hacking the process. More, I think it starts with a coordination. I think at a CARICOM level and then filtering up to AOSIS and any other blocks we're associated with, that we have to start now taking a really close look at who our partners are, ensuring that we remain aligned, ensuring that individual countries aren't enticed off agenda items, and to really press hard for this loss and damage angle. I think that's the hand the region has to play, the loss and damage bit. If you hold the other groups to account on that and say you'll move on nothing else that they all need, essentially threaten to nuke the process, if you will. I think is and small islands from the Caribbean have threatened in the past to pull out of the process. I mean, it's only a threat. We can never pull out of it because we absolutely need it. Multilateralism is the only outlet for small, vulnerable countries like ours. But you could make it a very difficult process for your larger country partners. The EU needs this to be a success as much as we do. And I think we just need to fully align on that position. And as much as Rowena kind of laid out what the costing and the structuring of that loss and damage facility might look like, there are different views about how we're going to champion loss and damage going into COP. So the V20, for instance, which is emerging as every COP is defined by a different negotiating bloc. The last time was really the HAC. At different points, it's AOSIS as a big player. This time it's going to be the V20. The V20 is what everybody wants to align with, and they've got research capacity. They've outlined a loss and damage funding mechanism. So it's more than what AOSIS primarily is championing, which is a loss and damage financing capacity. And I'm pointing it out because there are specific members of the Caribbean community that are members of a V20. So they're going to have two positions that have to champion. And I think the V20 position gives you a little bit more latitude to find success, because it's asking for a mechanism, a process with multiple tools that will get you to the eventual end. But a lot of those options are unpalatable for the Caribbean, because some of them includes taxing air travel, for instance. Can you imagine how Jamaica would react versus how Trinidad would react to, or Barbados and Jamaica would react to Trinidad on this? So we have to find alignment on exactly how we're going to champion what we want around loss and damage, which is, I think, a critical negotiating theme or entry point for this COP. So it starts with the diplomatic alignment and aligning on what, and I think that's the opportunity that we have.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tyrone. Dizan, if I could just follow up, I know Raheem has his hands up. It's just very quickly, because I think this question is for the benefit of everyone. Given that you mentioned that every COP is shaped by the COP presidency, given that they're hoping that after 7 years of talks between Paris and now, that this is the implementation COP, this is what they're calling it, that's not my words, that's theirs. This is supposed to be the implementation COP. Can the Caribbean, small island developing states, finally see access to climate financing, access to funding, access to that loss and damage that you talk about, funding for loss and damage? Can we, if this is really to be the implementation COP as they want to dub it, can we finally see that those things being realized for us in the small islands?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit blunt on it, and it's going back to what I was saying earlier. It's not going to be sweeping change. You will probably see one or two big wins. I think there's a possibility to see substantial momentum on the loss and damage front. Exactly what and how it will take shape is to be negotiated. I think that will be something we can claim as a big win from what you're seeing with the synthesis report, and they won't change substantially by the time COP comes. Don't expect to see sweeping cuts in emissions. I think there might be countries are supposed to come back to the table with a specific commitment to doubling their adaptation financing. I don't think we will get to double, but I think we'll see substantial movement towards that. If we can see that, we can claim that as a positive for implementation. So greater flows towards adaptation, some movement on the loss and damage aspect of things, and then of course a bunch of headline grabbing but tangential announcements are going to be made on the sidelines, especially from the private sector around net zero commitments, alignment, and stuff like that. But even that is at risk at this stage. I mean, if you look at Mark Carney's group, there are like endless reports, daily reports leading into this COP that the private sector is finding it difficult to honor its GFANZ commitments that were made at COP26. because now people are asking for we're moving towards implementation, like you're saying. And then when everybody realized that they have to actually be specific and they're going to be held accountable, whether at a regulatory level through things like TCFD, reporting and disclosure regulations, they're throwing their hands up. And it's the same thing the governments are doing too. Once you get to scrutiny, everyone wants to say less and to be committed to less, but you'll see momentum.
Thank you, Tyrone. Thank you, Dizan. Thank you, Rahim.
Thanks to you, Ryan. Very great questions. And thanks, Tyrone. So now we have a question from Rahim Smith. Rahim, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask Tyrone your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rahim Smith. I am a climate activist and I reside in Grenada. So Tyrone, I have a few questions, but I don't want to take up time because I know others will have questions to ask. So I've been following the climate change process in 2018, around there, I believe, when they had the climate conference in Poland, right? And of course, we are now in 2022. So the question I have for you, right? My first question is in the form of finance. I know that we speak on finance in regards to adaptation, mitigation, and all such. And of course, there are conversations in terms of the Santiago network on loss and damage, etc. Now that AOSIS is pushing for loss and damage financing, how do you think that this is something that will actually come through, given that we are now facing an economic crisis given the war with Russia and Ukraine? And obviously, this is not the priorities of many developed countries. So that's my first question.
Yeah, you're asking a great question, and I think it's a challenge that the region, all the vulnerable blocks are very well aware of, and the general narrative I think they need going into this is to remind the European partners in particular, because they're on the front lines of the crisis, the multiple crises, from the energy crisis to the inflation crisis, the political risks, that climate risks aren't divorced from that. The climate crisis isn't divorced from the other things. What you really need to address this whole litany of crises is a climate lens, right? Because they're all climate related. Had they been pro-climate from the start, then they would have started the energy transition and therefore be less vulnerable to Russian aggression, for instance. That's a fact, and I think many European policymakers recognize that. I think having the kind of problem analysis and awareness regionally, and just the confidence to articulate that and move forward with that clear starting point that, look, we recognize the cascading crises, but they're not divorced from the climate crisis. You need a climate lens. This is how we see it going. And this is why we think you need to not deprioritize climate. And the response that we need is how you move forward that discussion. Just recognizing that they're not separate things or contradictory things. It's just a matter of, can you manage complexities, especially when the underlying one, the permanent crisis, all these other crises will come and go. The climate crisis is permanent and consistent, and it doesn't contradict or undermine your ability to manage the others. It actually gives you a way to an off-ramp with managing the other ones, because the inflation crisis is primarily energy driven. The energy crisis is because they're addicted to the energy form that is the basis of the climate crisis, right? So just drawing that connection. And the reason I'm mapping it out like that is many of our ministers aren't like climate experts. They don't get that, right? So when they're divorced from the negotiators in their engagement, and they're divorced from the environmental ministry, then you can't fully drive forward with that kind of engagement. So that's why I think it's a coordination thing. It's fundamentally a coordination issue on all sides, but even more so for you when you're on the defensive, and we are on the defensive. So kind of in terms of problem solution and engagement from that mindset, I don't think they're contradictory. I think it's a challenge, and it's rightfully pointed out as a challenge. And my reaction is it shouldn't foreclose optimism and engagement and or expectations and you know what's at stake for us. In terms of being practical and how it will pan out, I think there will be substantial movement on adaptation financing. It's an obligation. Their entire credibility is banking on it. And I think there will be movement on loss and damage. The multilateral process is in everybody's interest. The Ukrainian crisis is reminding us that we need multilateralism, no matter its flaws. You need it. You need engagement more than anything else. And this is the second largest policy-making forum in the world after UNGA. They can't make it fail again.
Great question there, and thank you for that very good response as well, Tyrone. I don't know, I didn't see anybody else raise their hands. So I'm assuming that that's it for the questions. Of course, you can always reach out to either one of our speakers afterwards if you have any other questions that if you'd like to connect with them. So what I want to do next is basically at the core, Climate Tracker, Rahim, you're trying to unmute. You should be able to unmute yourself. Let me just. Can you try again?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I just have one more question, if you would allow me to ask.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. So my last question, Tyrone, is that now that I would say finally at the helm of the UNFCCC, we have a Caribbean national from my country, Grenada. The past environment minister, Simon Steele, is the executive secretary of the UN Climate Secretariat. How do you see this COP27 playing out, and also future COPs playing out now that a SIDS person is heading the climate change process?
Again, another great question. Boy, it's such a tough position for him. And I start with that because you know how we are as Caribbean people, we want a seat at the table, and our expectations immediately rise, but not always in a realistic way. And I'm saying that because UNFCCC has a particular role, which is to be a convener. It's a multilateral mechanism. So he occupies that role in service of the structure and the system and what it's designed to do, which is to serve all parties. So we have to, as you know, people who are proud of having one of our own in that seat, in the driver's seat, we have to also be mindful of that, right? But the positive for us is we depend on the UNFCCC process being at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, being robust, being efficient, being a success. And because we're the most dependent on it, having someone who represented us SIDS now at the helm is a big win, because he understands how vital it is for that to work well, for us to really be able to use that system efficiently. That's a benefit I see for us. That's a benefit I see for us. That's a benefit I see for other vulnerables. So you will see how that will play out is the engagement process that UNFCCC undergoes. It's thinking about where its meetings are held and how it engages with presidencies to facilitate the special needs and the challenges of vulnerables in being there and being able to fully engage at a because there are multiple meetings and engagements leading up to COP or pre-COP. I think those kind of structural things will work out in our favor. And so our voices will be more efficiently and routinely baked into the process. I think a couple of some of the blind spots that will exist for, historically Central American, Latin American, and European leads and other leads that the process have had will be mitigated. So I think that's where the wins will come, but it's not a case where it's going to mean we will get the outcomes we want necessarily. We're still going to have to negotiate for our lives for that. But yeah, I think it's a huge positive from an efficiency and perspective and strengthening the process. The process is what we need him to deliver for us. Yeah, a better process.
All right, thank you, Terence. So we'll take one more question. I see Ryan had his hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
I throw it in the chat just in case you didn't have time, but I just wanted to ask Tyrone your opinion. What do you think are the two biggest Caribbean stories at COP27 that journalists, if they are not looking out for it, they should certainly be looking into it?
The two biggest stories, they're not specific stories, but well, there is one. There's the Bridgetown Agenda that was launched by and is being substantially championed by MIA, might take off at this COP. There are a bunch of unreported meetings held in Bridgetown with a couple of very significant players. And what Prime Minister Motley is pushing for is not just a climate movement, but because you can't fix the climate crisis without unlocking global capital. She's been pushing for the reorientation, the rethinking of how the international financial institutions, specifically the IMF and the World Bank and things like the IDB functions. That's been her big mantra, and with big support from the Rockefeller Foundation, Open Society Foundation, a couple of other groups, and engagement with the World Bank, the UN, the IMF, and so on. They've started a process. Even her Kofi Annan speech recently at the International Press Institute delved into this big time. So if you have time to just go give that a listen, I'd encourage you to. I think there'll be some traction from it. I think it's worth looking at because it's tackling the same problem, but not in the kind of tangential way. Like you can make some side deals about monies, but the level and the scale of climate finance that we need, especially with like the special drawing rights mechanisms that you can access through the multilaterals, that's where you'll get resources at the scale you need, and especially working through some of the blockages around how you access resources automatically when you have a major flood or you get hit by a major hurricane like Grenada had in recent time, or we just saw ripping through the region. Those are the kind of levers she's pushing with the Bridgetown Agenda, and you will see some traction on this. It would be great to push for interviews, ask questions around it, and explore that. A bunch of side deals and discussions will happen. I'd say don't just pay attention to the core negotiations, and of course, what you're looking forward to are resources and pledges around adaptation. But some of the side stories, and I think an under-addressed or unexplored story is the private sector action. The Caribbean, the regional private sector is doing, frankly, a terrible job at anything on climate. And we keep pressuring the state, but remember, it's not just stuff for the state to do. You see all the net zero pledges taking place. You hear substantial discussions around management and disclosure of climate risks. We need to start asking questions of our large financial institutions, of our tourism industry, of our manufacturing industry. about what they're doing to make themselves climate resilient, climate ready? How are they adjusting to deal? Because the challenges are really direct for us. You know, there are questions that our teachers who have their life savings spent up in, you know, pension funds. What are the risks? Are they all kind of, if you are a teacher in Trinidad, is it that your pension fund is 90% exposed to sort of tourism properties in Tobago, all perched on the coast? It's a huge risk for you. Your entire life savings could go poof. Or is it just like, you know, sort of held up in oil and gas assets? These are questions that we have to ask. They're relevant to the man on the street in the region, and they get let off the hook. When those announcements are made at COP, there's a way to draw the link back to the Caribbean and ask, you know, or industry, chamber of commerce and stuff like that, what they're doing. How are they moving forward on those priorities?
Thank you, Tyrone. Okay, so we will take one more question, Tyrone, and I hope that that's okay. And I see Nicole Hendrickson has raised her hand. So Nicole's question will be last, and then we'll continue with the rest of the agenda for today.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Hi. Morning, everybody. I wanted to know what your thoughts are around to back up a little bit. A lot of the climate change issues that we are going to be affected by affect health. And we have made huge strides in the Caribbean around some of the SDG indicators around health. How do you possibly see any reconciliation around that? Plus, how do you think we could go about mitigating some of those challenges? So like, for example, the way they're saying that the heat index is going to rise is going to knock out our maternal and infant mortality rate as just one example. You know, how do you see any of that possibly being rectified? And I think you kind of answered that a little bit before with some of the financing answers that you asked, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts from a health perspective.
Yeah, I think you draw the right link there, and I'm really glad to hear that. Sort of climate related health risks in Caribbean, from increased vector-borne diseases. If you look at the risk atlas, and we have so much data in the region. A series of risk atlases were done for every Caribbean country. And that was one of the thematic areas where the risks were most apparent. And it comes down, now we've done the diagnostic work. We know what the risks are. We know for some of it, we know the time horizon on which we anticipate that they will become a material risks. The big challenge is to prepare, to manage those risks, those that we can actually manage. Because just like we were saying earlier, some of the risks are things that are unavoidable and you can never fully recover from. But fundamentally, you can largely adapt, you can adjust, and you have to keep adjusting because adaptation is not a permanent state. It will always change. You need monies for that. So it's again, going back to doing comprehensive thinking and planning, and it starts at a national level. Are your health ministries talking with your environmental ministries and your finance ministries? How comprehensive are your NDCs? How engaged is the population in their design and understanding what of the implications across sectors, where they link up, where they are concentrated? And that's the only way you're going to be able to cost those NDCs appropriately and keep updating them to make them relevant, and baking in the costs projections across your ministerial budget lines. I think that's where we have a gap with the conversations across the ministries, right? Increasingly, what's happening in the region and elsewhere is that climate change is moving out of the environmental ministries and more so into the finance ministries, because it's where the money bag is, to be blunt on it. Our countries are cash strapped, and development aid and support is scarcely available in terms of general development aid, and a lot of that money is being shifted under that climate frame because that's the big sexy topic now. So the finance ministries are really going after that without all the tools, and in some cases not comprehensively enough. And in this specific instance that you've raised is a great, we see a great example of why you have to have everyone at the table, including the health ministers. You can't be doing your climate finance, long-term planning, and your overall economic planning without considering the health implications and making sure that when you're drawing down monies through whatever special facility under a climate frame, that you will channel it in substantial ways that will address your critical pain spots, including health. I think that's where it starts. I'm going to just blame for terrible planning. And the reason I insist on the coordination element so much is having observed how developing countries engage in the climate space, I think circles are run around them all the time because of the lack of coordination. When they coordinate and think through things tactically, they win. But it's not routinely baked into how small countries, developing countries engage. You see stuff like the energy charter that's being revised, even as European countries are pulling out left, right, and center. And the charter is being revised to kind of say European countries will be exempt from being sued by private companies when they lose out of their fossil fuel pursuits because those countries are pivoting to renewables. They're still allowed to sue developing countries, the former colonies, if you want. It's kind of a colonial spin, but the way the engagement around that's being undertaken, it's with your trade ministries and your finance ministers in some cases, but you don't have the climate folks, the environmental folks who are very much aware of where the narrative is engaging on it. So you're going to end up with the same kind of bifurcated policy making, and you end up losing because your little trade department over here thinks they're winning a good deal, and the environmental folks could show them what their real risks are missing from it. So yeah, your health point is a powerful one. I bring it back to coordination, and it's a cross-sectoral challenge that we have.
Fantastic response to that very difficult question, Tyrone. So we're going to continue on today. So basically, Climate Tracker, at the core, we work to help journalists understand climate change, the environmental issues that are happening, and report on it. Right. So right now, most of the participants that we have on the call are actually fellows or past fellows, and they're tuning in to hear about COP, hear about the Caribbean perspective. And so that's why right now I'm really happy to bring on two of our past fellows to just bring a word of greeting and to share as well their experience last year, what they learned at COP, and what their word of advice would be for those that we have on the call who'll be writing stories about COP this year. So first of all, we have Zico, who is just disappeared. We have Zico, who will be bringing some words of advice for our reporters reporting COP stories this year. Zico?
All good?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So hi, everybody. I was an in-person fellow at COP26 in Glasgow last year. And personally, I had a really great experience. One of the most important things that I got out of my fellowship experience was, well, I guess there were several things. Firstly, it was a learning experience, a networking experience as well. Also a cultural exchange. What was pretty interesting about the group of fellows brought together by Climate Tracker, the 8 of us, we were all from, so to speak, Global South. So we were able to sort of bond over that and see how the different priorities that each of us had in terms of the type of coverage we were trying to do, find the, I guess, the linkages between these different things. So in preparing to go to COP26, one of the first things that I tried to do was figure out what my focus would be. Coming from Trinidad and Tobago, I quickly realized that the regional perspective, while all the Caribbean countries do come together to sort of push for a regional perspective, Trinidad and Tobago is in a unique position given its economy, as has already been mentioned, with oil and gas. And it's a space that Guyana has now entered into as well. So I realized that I had to identify, how am I going to go about my reporting? Am I going to report from the Trinidad and Tobago perspective, or am I going to look at this from the Caribbean perspective? And one of the first things that I had to do was really make some phone calls to people like Tyrone, for example, who had been in this space, to really figure out how I'm going to frame my stories. And I came to the conclusion that I really wanted to tell the story from a Caribbean perspective, because from being at COP26, I learned that the different Caribbean islands don't really have the capacity to have a full negotiation team representing each island. And of course, at this point in time last year, COVID added to the challenges that negotiators, activists, and whoever else was heading to COP26 would have faced in terms of being able to get access. So one of the strategies employed by the Caribbean is a sort of a pooling of resources strategy that is, I guess, channeled through multilateral organizations like CARICOM and IOSIS. And what this results in is, I think, a very unified, on the surface, a very unified messaging and a unified approach whereby different negotiators from maybe different islands or countries may be focusing on a specific issue. And because of that approach, I think the most interesting way I thought to approach telling the stories that I wanted to tell would be from a regional perspective. So I realized that one of the key issues that was going to come up in terms of what the different islands and different countries in the Caribbean was looking at was the topic of loss and damage, particularly in light of major hurricanes that would have taken place, like Irma, which hit Antigua and Barbuda in 2017, and the hurricanes that hit Dominica and the Bahamas, this topic of loss and damage. So I went into the climate conference deciding that I'm going to focus on loss and damage from the Caribbean perspective, and a little more broadly from the perspective of small island developing states, because like I said, it wouldn't just be a CARICOM push, but also one from IOSIS, to which many of the Caribbean islands would belong. This approach, I think, of really figuring out what you want to focus on beforehand is critical, because once you reach to the climate conference, you will discover that it is impossible to go in there as one individual and give a comprehensive overview of every single thing that is going on. If you try to do that, you're going to burn out, you're going to fizzle out, and you're probably not going to achieve very much. Being there too as a journalist, or should I say more specifically, an independent journalist from the Caribbean, you'll also feel like a large weight on your shoulder, because many of the other journalists that you will meet there from the region, you'll discover, are attached to a negotiation team. And so their role may fall more into the realm of communications, public relations, and that type of support. So if you go there as an independent journalist representing a media house from the Caribbean, last time I think I was the only one, you could quickly become overwhelmed by the fact that there's a lot to explore here. And you may feel as though I'm the only person who can tell this story from on the ground. But I don't think you can let that feeling overwhelm you because you'll get lost in it. So you really have to know before you arrive there what your focus is going to be and try to stick to it. Mine was SIDS, loss and damage, and really looking at how those conversations, what that negotiation process looks like. So just upon reaching there, you will, okay. So we're in a digital era, and of course, a lot of these services provided in terms of making a conference accessible has probably been perfected by this point because of COVID. So you will quickly discover upon arriving that every single thing that is being tagged as a major event or as the thing that everybody should be looking at is globally accessible. Get lost in the idea already making headlines or whatever active of smaller island states are to ask a direct question to a Caribbean leader who may not always be accessible in that format for you. Also to the networking experience isn't just necessarily about building your contacts, but you will meet lots of people just from walking around who will have conversations with you and may tell you certain things off the record that you might not be able to report on in a direct way, but just from having conversations, it will help you figure out, okay, these are the types of questions I should be asking. This is what I may be able to expect. There may be a major announcement. You might get tipped off that there's going to be a major announcement that might happen at a specific press conference. So you could then make it a priority to say, hey, I'm going to attend this press conference so I get the opportunity to report it as it happens, or to ask follow-up questions in the press conference that would follow. So I think that is probably the biggest piece of advice that I could give to anybody who is going in to cover a COP conference, is really know what your angle is beforehand. Don't be scared to keep it narrow, and don't get lost in anything that is already globally accessible. You'll reach there and discover that you're not even in the room most of the times. You're still looking at everything on a TV. Transcripts are going to be provided for different speeches. So the value is really in face-to-face conversations. Some of those side events, press conferences that may be not very well attended, but you may have a direct opportunity to really ask a Caribbean leader something important. One really interesting takeaway for me is that a lot of Caribbean leaders will have a very different approach in terms of their messaging at a conference, in contrast to how they would normally speak at home. And I think I personally would like to sort of see more reporting on how the messaging abroad maybe is at odds with sometimes with what is with how they would communicate at home. And I think that's maybe, getting an opportunity to ask a question at a press conference might be a great opportunity to really explore some of, dig into that a little bit more. Yeah, let me see what else I had here. And last thing that I think is that would have exploring ways of holding developed nations accountable for loss and damage. That was launched as a collaboration between Tuvalu and Antigua and Barbuda. that was a major announcement that took place at the last climate conference. So really looking at something like that, obviously the two major things that would have come out on the loss and damage front, if that's something that you're looking at in the Glasgow agreement, which would have been further operationalization of the Santiago mechanism and the creation of the Glasgow dialogue to look at loss and damage. So really following up on what was said, what commitments were made, pledges made by different Caribbean leaders. They've been, if you're looking at nationally determined contributions, I know there are different countries that are due to update NDCs, and different maybe commitments would have already been made last year with regards to when timeline for updating and things like that. So really just following up to see, okay, what's the status on that? And yeah, those are just some interesting observations that I guess I got out of my experience, and some of the things that I would hope to see followed up, to be followed up on by the journalists who are going to be looking at COP27 this year. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zico, for sharing a very important insight. And I know that it will definitely help our journalists who will be reporting at COP this year. So I want to bring on briefly as well to introduce to you Vishani Ragbir. Vishani was our COP26 reporter from Guyana. So Vishani, if you can just come on and share a little bit of information as well about your experience and what you learned from your experience last year.
Sure thing. Thanks for the invitation, Dizan. Good day, everyone. As Dizan mentioned, I'm Vishani from Guyana. I was the online fellow from the Caribbean last year. In the first instance, obviously online reporting was very different from the experiences Zico had, but I must say that with the sort of, I would say, training engagements that I had with the climate tracker team beforehand, which I'm sure Ryan and Terrell are benefiting enormously from. Those were very helpful because this was my first COP, and I did not expect that it would be as chaotic as it was, particularly navigating it from an online perspective. There were all these links. There were so many meetings going on all the time, and it was very much information overload at all times. So like Zico mentioned, it really required me to sit for a bit before the actual COP and think about what is it I really wanted to focus on. And so I think it's most understandable, as Zico mentioned, that in the first instance, I went into COP thinking about what would be most important to my audience, but to sort of still connect what I believe was most important to my audience with the wider Caribbean region, because we are, as a region, disproportionately impacted by climate change. And a lot of what happens there, I think, really affects us. The decisions that are made there really affects us. And it's important for us to sort of frame our reporting in that context, because it's important for the people of the region to understand that this just isn't some far off, distant talk shop. The discussions there actually impact our lives here. So that was the sort of thinking I went into COP with. And again, I'm from Guyana, so I went into COP with the knowledge that Guyana would be very rigid on its sort of dual pursuit of the low carbon oil and gas agenda. So I knew that was going to come up right away. So I thought about all of that. I thought about the people who might respond to that. I thought about what new position Guyana could come with, and what the reception to that might be. But it was also important to sort of, in the first instance, again, thinking just this is before going into COP, thinking about framing that within the context of equitable development for developing countries, because of course, oil and gas, but there's been a lot of conversation on how do we think about equitable development, because Guyana is a developing country. Guyana for years has protected its forests. So really, what's fair and for who? So that was what I was thinking about. And I was also thinking about sort of the wider energy security needs for the Caribbean. Definitely not as much as we're thinking about and discussing it now in the aftermath of the Ukraine-Russia crisis, but it was definitely a consideration then, because it wasn't just to report on Ghana, it was to report on Ghana within the context of the wider Caribbean region. So definitely I agree 100% with what Zico said. It's really important to think about what you want to focus on heading into COP, because it's going to be so many things coming at you all at once. I think also what was really important for me, so I do online reporting. So like we put out stories really fast at the newsroom. So like as soon as Mia, Prime Minister Motley finished talking at COP last year, I think she spoke at the opening ceremony. I think like 10 minutes later, my editor was like, yo, where's my story? We got to put it out there. But aside from the, you know, the big fancy political parts of it, like the big speeches and so like Prime Minister Motley is great, we know, but there are also other things to focus on. And I think as someone who has been given this opportunity to cover COP in the way that we were given the opportunity to cover COP, it's really important for you to also distinguish yourself and your reporting. So every single media house in Guyana will focus on the speech made by President Ali. Every single person will focus on that. But what distinguishes your reporting, and what are the stories you can tell that are really important to people, to your audience, and just stories that need to be told. So for me, that was connecting with the indigenous representation from Guyana at COP26. And I found that was really important because they didn't necessarily get much coverage from mainstream media, but in terms of the people who are most impacted by the climate crisis here in Guyana, the indigenous people are among those. So for me, that was something I really wanted to focus on. That helped me bring out the climate justice angle of COP26. That also helped me to sort of remove sort of the politics out of it. Well, everything is political, let me say, but it just sort of helped me bring it down to a level that it resonated and connected with people more, as opposed to hearing the president say something he has been saying all the time. He has been saying Guyana is going to pursue a low carbon oil and gas agenda. He's been saying that all the time. So what really connects to people now? What is new, fresh, and important to people? But I'll hasten to add, I wouldn't recommend, definitely not, ignoring the politics altogether, because again, our small countries are disproportionately impacted, and they come with strong messages too. I think I didn't necessarily expect it, but last year, what happened was, I think Guyana and Suriname actually they spoke on the same day. They spoke like 2 to 3 speeches apart, and they came with sort of a similar message. Of course, their messages were varied, but it was really important for me to listen to not only my president, but also the president of Suriname, because they both ended up speaking about carbon credits, getting payments for keeping their forests intact. And on its own, again, this is something that President Ali would have been talking about, but to also connect that with what President Santoki was now saying provides, I would say, just a more diverse story, so to speak, better perspective, more rounded perspective for your audience. And it just helps to show that, you know, this is not something that Guyana is making a fuss about. This is something that other people are making a fuss about. And also it was an important story to tell, because the whole carbon credit scheme in itself is something that many people are divided on. Some think it's a good thing, some think it's greenwashing. And these are all important reports that help to simulate conversation and get that moving forward. And then it also sort of opens up the way for you to talk to other stakeholders, talk to climate activists, talk to other policymakers to get their views on what's being said, whether this is achievable or not. So those were the 3 main things for me. Other than that, what can I say? It was just, if you're going to be reporting on COP, just enjoy it as much as possible. I love reporting on climate change because of where Guyana is right now, but also because I am a resident of Guyana, I am a resident of the Caribbean, and these discussions impact me personally. So, I mean, Terrell, you got your work cut out for you online. Zico was a big help for me, because Zico would be like, oh, XYZ is going to happen, you should probably find a way to find it, and so forth. So in this instance, Ryan is your crutch also. So make use of that for sure. Well, him, not that.
Thank you so much, Vishani and Zico, for your reflections on your COP26 experience. I want to bring on, so we're reaching to the end of our session, but before that, I'm really happy to have we have three Caribbean Fellows this year. One is Kalisha from Jamaica, Kalisha Williams. We have Ryan Beatrieu from Trinidad, who will be in person at COP, and we also have Terrell Gittens, who is from Trinidad and will be reporting online. So we have Ryan and Tyrell with us here today, and I just want to invite them briefly, each of them, to just give us a look into what you are looking forward to reporting on at COP27, and maybe a little bit about what you've learned, because both of them have been involved in hands-on training for the past 2-3 weeks leading up to COP. So tell us what you've learned maybe and what you're looking forward to covering at COP27. So we'll start with Ryan, and then Tyrell, you can come on afterward.
All right, thanks so much, Dizan, and good day to everybody. First of all, let me just say thanks so much to Zico and Vishani for 2 excellent presentations. When Dizan said, what we've learned over the last 2 weeks, I could summarize it in just one word, really. I mean, it has been overwhelming. I was telling a friend last night because she asked me, how does it feel headed across? And I said, it just seems so big and complicated and complex, but those 2 presentations from Vishani and Zico were excellent. And I just want to backtrack a little bit because just for the benefit of anybody else who's watching who might be in my position this year. Last year at COP26, I started covering climate change. So I'm young, I'm a baby in this thing, and started covering it on television. My editor came to me and asked me to lead CNC3 Television's coverage of COP26. And I was like, well, I've never really covered climate change or environmental or whatever things. Listen, this is your project, take it or feel it. Took it and I did my best with it. We had some decent coverage. I interviewed Zico, I think 2 times while Zico was across in Glasgow, and he was a huge help as he was for Vishani. So, and after that, did a couple courses, did some more courses, ended up stumbling over Climate Tracker and Dizan, and was lucky enough to do an energy transition fellowship and another course there. And it snowballed really into this opportunity. And I'm really grateful in that same breath, I must say, I'm really grateful to Dizan for all of the work that she's done with me and so many other fellows in that energy transition workshop and beyond to really help me to get to this point of confidence that I could actually do this. And yeah, so we've arrived at this point just over a week before we head across to Egypt for what are really critical climate talks 7 years after Paris. And that's what we've essentially done over the last 7 years. We've talked a lot. The pandemic put a pause on the progress or the supposed progress that we're supposed to be making as a globe, as a Caribbean, as continents. And now we've gotten to this point, as I was talking to Tyrone a little bit earlier, where world leaders are saying, or at least climate change leaders are saying, well, hang on, we've been to Paris, we've talked over the last 7 years, now it's time to implement, now it's time to act really. We have a lot of things on paper, now it's time to put it into action. So this is going to be a really critical climate change conference for myself to attend, Dizan, Kalisha, and Tyrell as well. And so over the last few weeks, we've really had I was telling them how interconnected both the Caribbean and where I live, Trinidad and Tobago, is when it comes to trade, when it comes to exportation and importation of EU goods and services. So it's all going to come together at COP27. And so over the last few weeks, it's been really good to enhance my knowledge in terms of how interconnected some of these continents are with the Caribbean. What are the things that we should be looking out for? like I said, I'm just, I'm just 1 year old into this thing, and learning about the terms and references and the glossary that I'll be required to. That was an early indicator. As one of the first sessions that we had in preparing in this fellowship. That was a huge help in terms of learning those references and terms. And so, headed to COP27 and listening to Vishani talk and listening to Zico talk, headed to COP27, essentially, I don't go to Egypt with too much of a different approach, really. I go to Egypt hoping that, to tell the stories of that the Caribbean needs the most, and I say the Caribbean, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, yes, and Trinidad and Tobago is having major effects from climate change. Every single time rain falls, it's flooding. Sometimes we have crippling heat, and farmers can't, they're all over the place and trying to have their patterns of farming. Yes, all of that. But I really want to broaden the approach and cover as much of the Caribbean as possible. And Zico said something very, Zico said something really, really important there, and that struck me because I've been trying to plan my coverage, and he said something very important. Don't feel bad if you're taking a narrow approach, and that was really, really enlightening for me, because like I mentioned at the start, this thing seems overwhelming, it seems huge, it seems complicated, complex, big, it seems all of that, and hearing him say that, don't feel bad if you go in with a narrow approach, that's fine. At least you'll be zoning in on something as opposed to trying to cover everything and sort of make a mess of it, and you're stretched and you can't in fact do it. So I go there with an open mind. I go there with a plan of action, and my plan is really to serve the Caribbean public as much as I can in bringing home Caribbean content that Caribbean readers and listeners and viewers will be able to say, I didn't know that before. Okay. I'm grateful for this information. And if I could do that, more than anything else, I would consider going to Egypt a huge success. Thanks again, Dizan.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, so now we'll hear from Tyrell Gittens, who will be one of our reporters as well, reporting online as part of the fellowship this year. Tyrell? It seems as though Tyrell might be having some technical difficulties. Just we'll wait 1 minute, a couple of seconds.
If I can just say in the meantime, while we wait on Tyrell, Dizan,
No problem.
I know it's a bunch of us here, and Tyrone has been a huge help, and he will continue to be a huge help because I intend to call him at some point this week. Tyrone, I know that's news to you, but I do. For everyone on this call, I just want to encourage you all to, Climate Tracker has so many different social media platforms and all. We'll be, while we're there and here, to keep in touch with us. If you have story ideas or things that you think that are breaking or that we should be covering, we will be open to listening to all suggestions and to ensure that that we really cover this in a really Caribbean centric and comprehensive way. And I think Tyrell is waiting to come in, Dizan.
Yeah, Tyrell is just joining us again. I think he was
Great.
having some technical difficulties. Tyrell, yes, we can hear you. We can see you. We can hear you now.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry about that. I was like scrambling, trying to figure out what was happening. So apologies for the delay. Firstly, thank you very much to Zico and Vashani for sharing their experiences from covering the previous COP meeting. And thank you very much to everyone who decided to take the time this morning to join the hangout. It shows that people are interested in the issue of climate change, and this is really a collective learning experience and a collective effort. If we are to make any progress on climate change, I'm incredibly grateful to the ZAN and the Climate Tracker team for the support that they have provided over the last several weeks as we have been preparing to cover COP. As it has been mentioned, I'm one of the online fellows, but I'm not daunted by the challenge, and I look forward to having a great experience. Nonetheless, as a journalist, as a writer, I'm also a geographer and an environmentalist and a conservationist. So I have academic training in those issues. I see myself as someone who has to contribute towards environmental knowledge, because I always say it, like in any conversation I'm having, I'm very passionate about environmental knowledge and the importance of it. I believe if we are to make people more climate conscious or even adopt, environmentally friendly practice, we have to be able to educate them properly on the issues we are facing and the role they play. So this is what I want to um, relay during my coverage of COP27. Um, I definitely, understand there'll be a lot of high level discourse. And if you walk up to, the stage, you will see community. Oh, right. To be able to help everyone, see themselves not only in the issue of climate change, but the discussions that will be happening. And that's something that have stood out to me so far in all the different training sessions that I have participated in. We have had more than five, a little, if I am correct, about probably eight, from different presenters and different perspectives, but something that has been a foundation of all the presentations has been, yes, we understand that they will be speaking about a lot of issues such as adaptation, mitigation, financing, loss and damage, but every presenter has been vocal thus far in reminding us to keep it rooted in our communities. And the communities will be reporting and covering the conference for. And I think again it's very important. For example, climate loss and damage, especially living in a small island developing state like Trinidad and Tobago, notwithstanding we are unique in terms of our energy usage and economy and so forth, we still face the effect of climate change. As I've always been saying, we lie outside of the hurricane belt, and traditionally, hurricanes and tropical storms really develop in our end of the region. Given the climatic conditions traditionally wasn't conducive to tropical development. But in the last 5 years alone, we have had run-ins with a series of tropical storms, which in itself should say something to people that the climatic conditions are changing. And we are really on the front line of this issue of climate change. We have this saying that God is a Trini, and if anything, the past few years, should show us that we should really take these issues a little more seriously and not as lightly as we have been in the past. I think as a society, Trinidad needs to focus on adaptation because we have this year alone, I've had a lot of extreme flooding events just from tropical waves. So, which we are accustomed to having tropical waves. So if that is just what we are facing with tropical waves, imagine now that we are getting closer to and closer to the development of tropical storms and hurricanes in this region. So by telling stories from those perspectives and telling people this is how we are on the front line, this is how it's affecting us, this is how it's affecting our communities, that I think would be very important, and it's definitely something I'm interested in focusing on in my storytelling and all aspects of the issues that we covered from COP. But something else that we have also been reminded, and I think it's important, is also questioning, some of the decisions that our leaders make. So Trinidad and Tobago is signatory to probably any multilateral, environmental agreement that you could find on the face of the earth. We are signatory to that agreement, which is great, which shows that, we see the importance of being signatories to those agreements and, partaking in the collective action against climate change. However, when it comes to actual policies and on the ground, action, there's a disconnect. We still have, some of our leaders speaking about oil and natural gas being the backbone of our economy and being the future. While we are currently in the middle of a climate crisis and understand indeed of, climate mitigation in terms of reducing emissions and so forth. So if our leaders, and, I'll be particularly interested in seeing what discussions we partake in, probably what targets we set for the next several years, and in that ask the relevant questions. Okay, we said that we understand we need to reduce emissions or contribute to climate financing. One of our officials that would be at the conference, Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, he's very experienced and has done a lot of great work. Both Ryan and myself had had the honor of interviewing him. He would be sitting on one of the recently formed financing communities. So if we are setting, goals to probably improve financing here at home or in the Caribbean, we want to ask those questions. Okay, we have made this pledge. How are we going to fund it? What are some of the policies that are going to be taken shape? And we also need to question a lot of the plans that they have been developing. So this is my last point. I know, interviewing Mr. Kumar saying he would have highlighted that there are efforts going on to have a electric vehicle policy and so forth. But, we also need to ask follow-up questions, like how that policy will be rolled out. I think, personally, I think Trinidad has a huge issue as it relates to the amount of vehicles we have. I always bring up this point. We have a very tiny population, just 1.4 million people, and we have more than 1 million cars. So obviously you could just imagine we have traffic problems and so forth. So if like an electric vehicle policy comes on stream, are we just going to be adding more cars? Would there be like some effort to remove some of the existing cars? So those are some of the questions we need to ask. It's great that we have leaders that understand the importance of being signatories, attending COPs, sending delegations. We are always very well represented at these discussions, but we need to follow up on what progress is being made. And I know I said that was my last point, but my last point, because I know, the hangout has been going on for a while. A lot of my storytelling, I want to focus on solutions. I genuinely believe we have spoken enough about the problems and we understand what the problems are. Climate change is not something new. That's not an issue that we just, get up today and dealing with. So I really, really, really want my stories to focus on the solutions and what is being done. So as I tell you, we are making goals, and that just relates to the entire Caribbean as well, because some of my reporting will be, general small island developing states issue. We are making all these big commitments, but I would love to see how we are translating that to tangible efforts on the ground so I could go to bed at night knowing, families are being empowered to reduce their emissions and to adopt more climate conscious practices. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tyrell, and thank you, Ryan. And also big thank you to all of you who sticked with us, who stuck with us this morning for this I think it was a long session, but we learned a lot. I agree with Ryan that today's session really touched on a lot of lot of points that are very critical for island states and for the Caribbean countries going into COP. And this recording, of course, will be made available to you, to each of our registrants. So before we close off, I would really love to get a screenshot of those who would be comfortable enough to put on their video. You can do so now. And we'd just like to get a quick screenshot of those of us who are kind of remaining. Oh, hi, Chelsea. So anybody else wants to put on your video maybe? Vishani, hi Vishani. All right, I guess that's probably it for now. So I'll take that screenshot on 2, 1, 2. All right, thank you so much. I trust that each and every one of you learned something new today and feel a little bit more informed about the COP27 Caribbean perspective. If you have any questions about it at any time, about Climate Tracker, if you want to get in touch with any one of our reporters, of course, you can just reach out to me, and I'll be more than happy to hear from you. So thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.